Namaskar, Dr. K Tiwari here on the platform of the New Lyceum for English Literature, and today I start a series of lectures on literary theory. Right, in my previous series you have watched 21 videos on literary criticism, and today literary theory, one of the most important areas, one of the most important topics for your examination Nta-Net in English literature. This topic is equally important for the MA students and for the students who are seeking their PhD. Topic is also important for the students who are looking for CUET entrance examination for MA in different central universities or state universities. Right? New criticism. The topic is new criticism. What is criticism? It has been told to you in the series of essays on literary criticism, and from literary criticism we have arrived to new criticism. What is new in the criticism and what was old in the criticism, and how is new different from the old one? What are the features, what were the features in fact of old criticism, and how we arrived at new criticism? What is the need of new criticism? In fact, actually old criticism talked about biography, talked about geography, talked about sociology, talked about politics and the impact of all these fields on literature, and it was said that literature reflects society, literature is the product of society. But new criticism says no, literature is not the product of society, but the meaning that we deduce, that we get, meaning comes from the text itself. There is no meaning outside of the text, as Derrida said later. Meaning is on the page, meaning is in the text, right? Meaning is nowhere outside the text. You do not need any biographical, sociological, political approach to analyze a piece of literature, especially a piece of poetry. This is new criticism, right? From the text that was surrounded by society, that was surrounded by politics, now we have arrived to the autotelic text. Now texts are autotelic, and this autotelic text is the main feature of new criticism. What is autotelic? Autotelic means text speaks themselves. Texts speak themselves. You do not need to go out of the book, you do not need to go out of the word. You have to be here and you have to comprehend the meaning with word play. Right? Here a critic, especially a new critic, he believes in formalism. Form is more important rather than content. In the old criticism, in literary criticism, starting from Plato to T.S. Eliot, to a certain extent T.S. Eliot, criticism was basically the product of society. As Matthew Arnold said that criticism, the function of criticism is an endeavor, a disinterested endeavor to know the best, to learn the best, and then to propagate the best. The function of criticism was to create an environment for the poets. But new criticism is a bit different. Let's see what are the features of new criticism, and who were the new critics, and what was the requirement of new criticism, one by one. Let's start. This is the world. This is the textual world. And from textual world, you come to new criticism, that is a literary theory. And this is my name, Dr. K Tiwari. And the platform is the New Lyceum. What is criticism? Actually, according to Professor Rajnath, I have been the student of Professor Rajnath who taught at the University of Allahabad, and I am lucky I was the student of his last batch day back in 2004-5, right? I was taught by him, and he wrote several books on criticism. He was PhD from the University of Leeds, and he was professor, one of the most eminent professors in the field of literary criticism. he told us that there are two types of criticism: intrinsic criticism and extrinsic criticism. Intrinsic criticism and extrinsic criticism, and new criticism is a part of intrinsic criticism. Intrinsic criticism means meaning is in the text. Meaning is in the text. You have to evaluate. You have to judge a piece of literature on the basis of the words and their relationships, their relations with other words. That is intrinsic. And when he talked about extrinsic criticism is the product of outside world. Intrinsic criticism is the product of outside world, and that was literary criticism, right? Outside world, sociological criticism or political criticism or biographical criticism or historical criticism or anything. But intrinsic criticism is totally different, and that intrinsic criticism was started by the formalist, by formalism, especially the Russian formalists, and from Russian formalists we come to new critics. Criticism can be divided into two major categories of intrinsic and extrinsic criticism. The former approaches a work of literature from within, means intrinsic approaches a work of literature from within in its own context, while the latter brings external values like those derived from psychology, sociology and other disciplines to bear upon literary discussions and evaluate. Right? Of these two categories of criticism, the former has been claimed as genuine. Intrinsic criticism has been claimed as genuine and bona fide, original, and the former has often been claimed as genuine and the latter as impure or non-literary. Means literary criticism is non-literary. Literary criticism, old criticism is non-literary. Biographical criticism, sociological criticism, political criticism, right? They are non-literary, they are not genuine, they are not bona fide. But intrinsic criticism is bona fide, because while evaluating a piece of literature, while evaluating a piece of work, we don't have to go outside the text. That's why we concentrate on literature that is written, and new criticism says that it is pure, it is bona fide, it is intrinsic, it is autotelic. Alright, so this was the slide number 1, right? Criticism and intrinsic and extrinsic criticism. From intrinsic criticism is the concern of those who center their discussion on the text itself. Who center their discussion on the text itself. This is autotelic feature. On the text itself, rigidly or with some allowance. This tradition, originating with T.E. Hume and passing through T.S. Eliot and I. Richards, has found its most effective manifestations in the New Critics and Chicago Critics. In fact, Chicago Critics were a part of New Critics, but totally against the New Critics. Chicago Critics were called New Aristotelian Critics. I will talk on them later on. Right? Intrinsic criticism is the concern of those who center their concern, who center their discussion on the text itself, rigidly or with some allowance. Right? Where did it start? It originated with T.E. Hume, and then from T.E. Hume it came to I. Richards and T.S. Eliot, and from T.S. Eliot, from I. Richards, from F.R. Lewis, it came to J.C. Ransom, right? J.C. Ransom, John Crow Ransom, who wrote a book, New Criticism, and the title has been taken from there only. And not only T.E. Hume or T.S. Eliot or I. Richards, but in fact, Mr. John Keats, he also talked about this type of criticism. The poet is the most unpoetic. He called the poet chameleon poet. And then Matthew Arnold said, talked about the objectivity of the critic, and then T.S. Eliot talked about the theory of impersonality. Right, theory of impersonality means he was also denying the subjective approach. Right, he was also denying the subjective approach, and he came to the objective approach. And then the two groundbreaking books written by Mr. I.A. Richards, The Principles of Literary Criticism and Practical Criticism. And I.A. Richards was a professor, and he used to hand out a text, a piece of poetry to his students, removing the name of the writer and his or her age, and then he asked the students to evaluate the poem on the basis of the text, and students evaluated. That was the beginning of new criticism. That was the beginning of intrinsic criticism. From I.A. Richards, T.S. Eliot, T.E. Hume, these two are said to be the pioneers in the field of new criticism. I hope you identify these two photos. This is none other than the great poet of the 20th century, at least first half of the 20th century, the great critic of the first half of the 20th century, and one of the great dramatists of one of the first half of the 20th century, the Nobel winner T.S. Eliot, and he is I.A. Richards. I.A. Richards is also very famous, very famous for his sense of meaning, for his 4 types of meanings, for his 2 uses of language, for his practical criticism, and for his principles of literary theory. Right? These things are to be attributed to I.A. Richards. These two were the pioneers in the field of new criticism in the beginning of 20th century. Right, in the beginning of 20th century, T.S. Eliot's essay Tradition and Individual Talent, and then his collection of essays published in 1820 under the title The Sacred Wood. Right, Sacred Wood में जो इनके articles were published, right, they were groundbreaking, and they pioneered, they paved the way, they paved the path for new criticism. All right, then these are the books, these are the important books that are generally asked in your examinations. Books regarding on new criticism: The Sacred Wood, The Practical Criticism, The Principles of Literary Criticism, The Well-Wrought and Studies in the Structure of Poetry, New Criticism, Modern Poetry, and the Tradition. And one more book, 7 Types of Ambiguity, and I will talk about that book in the next part of our lecture. These are the names of the book, and it is for you. You have to note down the writers of these books and the basic contents of these books, basic theories of these books. Beginning with the purpose. New criticism, and everything starts with the purpose. What was the purpose of new criticism, and when did it begin? When did it start? It arose in 1920s and 1930s when T.S. Eliot and I.A. Richards were on their peak. Become the dominant form of academic criticism until well into the 1960s. From 1920s to 1960s, this 40 years period is generally attributed to new criticism, though the term new criticism was coined much later. The principles of new criticism was to locate the meaning of a literary work, not in the intention of the author, nor in the experience of the reader. Intention of the author, it is called intentional fallacy, and the experience of the reader, it is called affective fallacies. 2 fallacies were given by Wimsatt and his friend. Intention of the author means if you are evaluating a piece of literature on the basis of intention of the author, means you are doing something wrong, you are committing an error, you are committing a mistake, you are committing a fallacy, and that fallacy is called intentional fallacy. Intentional fallacy. And if your criticism is based on the experience of the reader, then you are committing another fallacy that is called affective fallacy. That is called affective fallacy. Wimsatt and Beardsley. These two critics coined these two phrases, intentional fallacy and affective fallacy. I hope you would have understood the meaning of both the terms. Intentional fallacy means the error that you commit. Affective fallacy means the error that you commit. Intentional fallacy is based on the intention of the author for which from which intention he composed the text, and if you are committing the mistake that is based on the experience of the reader, it means you are affected by the reader. That is affective fallacy. The reader gained critical understanding through a process of close reading. Close reading, reading on the page only, no open reading. Now the text has been diminished. The limitation has been fixed. Now you have to be only focused on page. You don't have to go anywhere, right? If you are reading a piece of newspaper, then the entire meaning lies here. You do not need to know about the author. You do not need to know about the experience of the reader. You don't have to go anywhere. You have to remain here. Everything is here, right? Everything is here. You do not need any historical knowledge. You do not need any biographical knowledge. You do not need any sociological knowledge. You do not need to know the political background of the reader. You do not need to know the sociological background of the reader, right? You have to focus on the text only. That is called close reading, right? That is called close reading. Strict attention to the characteristics of literary work as conveyed by such elements as irony, paradox, tension, imagery, and symbol. Right? You have to deduce a text with the help of these elements. Elements are irony, elements are paradox, elements are tension. Tension, what is tension? Ellen Tate talked about extension and intention, and out of the two he coined one word, that is tension. Imagery and symbol. These are the tools through which you can explicate a text, right? Through which you could do a close reading. All right. What not to do? What to do? Close reading. And what not to do? Not to be influenced by intentional fallacy, not to commit intentional fallacy, and not to commit affective fallacy. Among the errors to be avoided were the intentional fallacy, the attempt to locate meaning in the author's intention. The attempt to locate the meaning in the author's intention is called intentional fallacy. And the affective fallacy, the attempt to search for meaning in the experience of the reader, right? These two things are to be avoided first, and affective fallacy and intentional fallacy. And apart from these two, something more is to be avoided. Also to be avoided, or at least subordinated to close reading, were extrinsic, that is not dealing exclusively with the language of the text, approaches to the study of literature, social, psychological, economic, political, or historical. These areas to be avoided while evaluating, while writing a piece of criticism on literature, while reading a text. These things are to be avoided. All right, extrinsic things are to be avoided. Intentional fallacy you are not supposed to make, and affective fallacy you are not supposed to make. That is the part of close reading. What not to do? What to do? Close reading. What not to do? Intentional, affective, and extrinsic. One more fallacy I want to add here. Extrinsic fallacy. There should no there should be no extrinsic fallacy in reading a text while reading a text. Text and context. New criticism can be said to have begun with the publication of I.A. Richardson's Principles of Literary Criticism is 1924, and in 1929 the practical criticism. The earlier work offered a theoretical framework, while practical criticism argued for a close study of the language of a poem in order to analyze its poetry, and new critics especially focused on poetry only. In England, William Impson's book 7 Types of Ambiguity, that published in 1930, is a classic new critical text and a striking example of the close reading technique advanced by Richards. According to William Impson, there are 7 types of ambiguities, there are 7 types of ironies, and apart from Richards, the single most important figure in the development of the school was T.S. Eliot, who lent his prestige as a poet to the movement, frequently endorsing its principles in his own criticism. Alright, the new criticism, the very term, was coined by the American critic J.C. Ransom, John Crow Ransom, in a book of that title published in 1941. Of far greater influence was textbook edited by Robert Penn Warren and Clint Brooks in 1938. Brooks and Warren's understanding poetry had a profound effect on the teaching of literature in American college for the next 2 decades. As a consequence, the study of literature was frequently sealed off from social, historical, and political concerns in favor of rigorous, eminently teachable formalism. In recent years, this aspect of new criticism has been critiqued for its alleged hidden agenda. And what was its hidden agenda? A defense of traditional religious and cultural values under the guise of advocating the autonomy of literature. Everything has its pros and everything has its cons. Everything has its admirers, everything has its critics, right? So new criticism was also appreciated by a few and depreciated by a few. Even people investigated, even people inquired the agenda behind the propagation of new criticism, right? That is totally different matter. We do not have to seek criticism on new criticism, but here we are just trying to understanding what are the components, what are the essence, what are the basic principles of new criticism, and I hope you would have understood the point that I want to convey here, that the new criticism conveys to all of us. If still any doubt, you can write to me directly, you can drop your message in the comment box, you can write to me on my Telegram channel, the New Lyceum for English Literature, or you can directly contact me anytime at my college. I'll be there to take all your queries. You can write social media, bahut sare hain hai. You can come to me through any means. Right? Next point is R.S. Crane. R.S. Crane was one of the prominent critic of the area, and he had given impetus to new criticism by his comment on criticism. What is criticism? And R.S. Crane says that if you are evaluating a piece of literature on the basis of psychology, on the basis of sociology, on the basis of history, on the basis of geography, it means you are doing a case study. You are not writing a critical piece. You are not reading a text. You are doing a case study. Suppose that if you read a novel by Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, you are the arrow of God, then first of all you try to know about Chinua Achebe. You try to know the age of Chinua Achebe. You try to know the social setup of Chinua Achebe, and then you locate the text, right? You put the text into that area, and then you conclude that Things Fall Apart is a post-colonial text. But R.S. Crane was totally against this type of criticism, right? He was against this type of social, political, historical, geographical background, but in fact he was concentrating, he was focusing on the text. It is not criticism but psychology when we treat poems or novels as case books and attempt to discover in them not the art but the personality of their author. Right? It was one is the movement. New criticism was one step ahead of art for art's sake. Right? If you are, it is not criticism but psychology when we treat poems or novels as a case book and attempt to discover in them not the art but the personality of the authors. It is not criticism but history or sociology when we read imaginative writings for what they may tell us about the manners or thoughts or the spirit of the age which produced them. It is not criticism but ethical culture when we use them primarily as a means of enlarging and enriching our experience of life or of inculcating moral ideals. It is not criticism but autobiography when we content ourselves with stating our personal preferences with regard to them or the adventure of our souls in their presence. Criticism, as we shall understand it, is not only of these things, it is simply the disciplined consideration at once analytical and evaluative of literary work as work of art. Literary work as a work of art, and if you are evaluating with the help of the above mentioned points, then you are not doing criticism, you are doing something else that is not part of criticism, but in fact you are doing a case study, and you don't have to do a case study, you are doing a literary criticism, and in doing literary criticism you do not to go out of literature, you have to be here. This was the opinion, right, given by R.S. Crane, right, J.C. Ransom, R.S. Crane, right, Clint Brooks, Ellen Tate, I.A. Richards, T.S. Eliot. The book, The New Criticism, the book was written by J.C. Ransom. Structure, he divides, he talks about texture and structure. What is texture and what is structure? And he gives the example of a building. I will show you the building. जिसका example उन्होंने दिया है. J.C. Ransom says, structure is the story. Structure is the story. The object, the situation, or whatever which gives us the argument of the poem, and texture is the thingness of things by which it was particularized. Thingness of the things by which it was particularized. Texture and structure. What is structure? Structure is the story. Structure is the object. Structure is the situation or whatever which gives us the argument of the poem. And what is texture? Texture is the thingness of the things which it is particularized. This is the building. This is the building. Where is texture and where is structure? The walls of my room are obviously structural. Pillars, walls, these are structural. The beams and boards have functions. So does the plaster, which is the visible aspect of the final wall. The plaster might have remained naked, aspiring to no character and purely functional. Had there been no plaster, home will remain home. But actually, it has been painted, receiving color, or it has been papered, receiving color and design, though these have no structural value, nor perhaps it has been hung with tapestry or with paintings or decorations. The paint, the paper, the tapestry are texture. it is logically unrelated to structure. The outside things जो हैं, outside things क्या है? Paint, paper, tapestry, they are textures, right? They are textures. They are not related at all to the structure. They are not related at all to the structure, means these paint, paper, sociology, biography, history, polity, they are texture. They are not in fact related to structure. This was the statement given by J.C. Ransom in his book The New Criticism, published in 1941, and this passage is quoted in Professor Rajnath's book Literary Criticism, right? The essay is quoted in his book. Sorry, not essay, but in fact this quotation has been taken from there. Uses of language. I.A. Richards talked about two uses of language: emotive use of language and scientific use of language. Emotive use of language and scientific use of language. Emotive use of language is made of pseudo statements according to I.A. Richards. From I.A. Richards, it comes to Clint Brooks, and Clint Brooks says that there are two types of words: denotative and connotative. Denotative is static, connotative is dynamic. Denotative means the dictionary meaning, connotative means there are several meanings, right? If you read a piece of newspaper, then all the words have only one meaning. You cannot take, you cannot apprehend, you cannot understand two meanings of a word. Otherwise, you will lose the entire content, right? The newspaper is written in denotative words, right? The newspaper is printed, is written in a denotative word. There are nothing like connotative. The meaning of the newspaper, the meaning of the news is only one, that is static. But once we go to literature, there are multiplicity of meaning, there is plurality of meaning. You cannot control the number of meanings, that is connotative. And literature is made of pseudo statements, as I.A. Richards had said. The new critics concentrate exclusively on the language of poetry and account for its structure in terms of the layers of meaning the words are charged with. Alan Tate posits the supremacy of the poet's language in his assertion that in the long run, whatever the poet's philosophy, by his language shall you know him. Whatever the poet says, whatever his philosophy is, you will understand, you will know only him through his language. By his language shall you know him. The quality of his language is the valid limit of what he has to say. The new critics make a twofold semantic division of language into denotation and connotation. Denotation and connotation, the former being the literal or dictionary meaning. Denotation is the literary meaning which suffices, for example, in scientific discourse, and the connotation is suggestive meaning brought forth in the poetical context. The division of meaning has obviously been derived from I.A. Richards, who distinguished between the scientific or symbolic and the poetic or emotive use of words in almost all his major works. Everything is the sport of language. There are two types of uses, and emotive use, scientific use according to Mr. I.A. Richards, and denotative and connotative according to Clint Brooks, and according to Alan Tate, it is the language by which you will always be remembered, by which you can convey your philosophy. Alright, uses of languages, and then after the uses of languages you have connotation and denotation, and I already told you the meaning of connotation and denotation, and there is no confusion. Home denotes the house, single meaning. Home denotes the house where one lives, but connotes privacy, intimacy, and coziness. This is the connotation of home. Home means house. That is only one meaning, right? When you say that his home caught fire, it has only one meaning. And when you go to buy a flat in an apartment, then the advertisement says that there are 3 living rooms, right? 3 living rooms in your home. Home buy karte ho aap, plot for home aap kharidte ho, right? That is the reason estate agents like to use home instead of house in their advertisements, because home represents coziness, home represents intimacy, home represents privacy, and you will get everything in your home, not in house. House is Parliament House, house is White House, right? That is not meant for privacy, but your home connotes privacy, your home connotes intimacy, your home connotes familyness, your home connotes friendship, your home connotes everything that you need. इसलिए you go to your home, not go to your house. House, right? House is made of bricks, and home is made of emotions, home is made of relations, home is made of everything जो house में नहीं होती है. Right? Now, after connotation and denotation, the difference between connotation and denotation is static versus dynamic. Denotative is static, denotative is scientific, and connotative is dynamic. To a new critic, the richness of a poem inheres in the richness of the meaning. He often contrasts the meaning of a scientist with that of a poet. The opposite of science is poetry. The opposite of science is poetry, and the opposite of poetry is science, not prose. Mind it. Opposite of poetry is not prose. Opposite of poetry is science, as there is no semantic difference between prose and poetry. The difference is that of usage of language. The meaning of the scientist is static, whereas that of the poet is dynamic. Clint Brooks: the tendency of science is necessarily to stabilize terms. This is the quotation from Clint Brooks' textbook, Understanding Poetry, right? Clint Brooks says the tendency of science is to necessarily to stabilize terms, to freeze them into strict denotations. The poet's tendency is something different. The poet's tendency is, by contrast, disruptive. The terms are continually modifying each other and thus violating their dictionary meanings, right? The meaning of a piece of literature, the meaning of the piece of poetry is not contained in dictionary, because it connotes a lot of things. It connotes something that is not written anywhere, but because that's why the language, the meaning of poetry is dynamic. It never stays, it keeps on floating. While the scientific language is static, it cannot float. Dynamic versus static, right? And from dynamic to static, now one more quotation from Clint Brooks. The language of a poet is a language in which the connotations play as a great part as the denotations. In language of poetry, connotation and denotation both play equal parts, but in the language of science there is no connotation, only denotation, right? Tension is a term coined by, in fact you could say, as far as criticism is concerned, by Alan Tate. Alan Tate goes on to formulate his basic critical term tension, namely tension, which is derived from looping the prefixes of the logical terms extension and intension. The term tension points to the balance of extension and intention, which are identical with Clint Brooks's denotation and connotation, or Ransom's structure and texture respectively. The poet sets off denotation and connotation against each other for the creation of new meaning. Alan Tate's tension, J.C. Ranjam's texture and structure, Clint Brooks, denotation and connotation, I.A. Richards, pseudo statements or emotive use of language or scientific use of language. And then William Impson's, the book published in 1930, 7 types of ambiguity. And these 7 types of ambiguity I have taken from P.K. Nair's book Contemporary Literary and Cultural Theory. There are 7 types of ambiguities according to William Impson. Impson's taxonomy of ambiguity moved from simple ambiguity such as double meaning to outright contradictions. Number 1, he begins with words that seem to mean several things at once due to similar sounds. Similar sounds, several meanings. Second type, 2 meanings merge into one. Third, 2 seemingly unconnected meanings are given together. Fourth, alternative meanings combine to confuse interpretation. Fifth, there is some confusion that the author has discovered as he went along and is the result of the author not being able to hold the entire work in his head when composing. Sixth, irrelevance constitutes the ambiguity and the reader has to make a choice. And finally, 7th ambiguity is outright contradiction and antagonistic meanings are deployed by the author. These are the 7 types of ambiguities in a text. Write 7 types of ambiguity according to William Impson. And then finally, irony. Irony, the queen of irony is Jane Austen, right, who started her novel Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a man of good fortune must be in want of a wife. Right, such type of sentence she wrote in the beginning of her novel Pride and Prejudice. Irony. There are several types of irony. Who talked about irony? According to I.A. Richards and according to T.S. Eliot, there are 2 types of irony. T.S. Eliot terms irony as wit. Right, this is a number of writers associated with the new criticism used irony, although in a greatly extended sense, as a general criterion of literary value. Right now, this slide is from M.H. Abrams, A Glossary of Literary Terms. This use is based largely on 2 literary theories, T.S. Eliot and I.A. Richards. T.S. Eliot praised a kind of wit characteristic in his view of 17th century metaphysical poets, but absent in the romantic poets. Wit was present. Wit means irony. Irony was present in the metaphysical poets of the 17th century, but the romantic poets lacked this wit, which is an internal equilibrium that implies the recognition in dealing with any one kind of experience of other kinds of experience which are possible. And I.A. Richards defined irony in poetry as an equilibrium of opposing attitudes and elevations in his book The Principles of Literary Criticism. Irony in this sense consists in the beginning of the opposite, the complementary impulses. That is why poetry is exposed to it is not of the highest order, and why irony itself is so constantly a characteristic of poetry, which is right. Now I hope everything is clear, everything is fine, everything is okay. I hope you would have enjoyed the video and you would have understood all the points very thoroughly and you won't have any confusion. It is my belief, but if you are against my belief, if still you have any problem, if you have still any query, comment box is always open for you. Right, you can subscribe to the channel, The New Lyceum for English Literature. You can share this video among your peers, among your friends who are also preparing for the same serious examination, who are seeking their career in higher education. This video will definitely be helpful to all of them. It's my belief. Thank you so much for watching me. Thank you so much for paying your attention. I'll meet you very soon with the next video, and that video hopefully will be on structuralism. All the best. Good luck. Thank you. Jai Hind. Jai Bharat.